discovered in the United States in 1859, it only truly became a major industry there since 1901, when a drill at Spindletop Hill, near Beaumont, Texas, erupted a massive amount of crude oil, flooding an area over a kilometer long. This is considered the heralding point for the emergence of the oil industry in the United States, and since then the nation's oil and gas industry has continuously developed. Currently, this industry includes the exploration, production, processing, transportation, and marketing of natural gas and petroleum, along with petroleum products. After over 100 years of formation and development, the United States is now one of the world's leading oil-producing countries. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the country's oil reserves are approximately over 47.1 billion barrels, ranking 11th. According to OPEC data, U.S. reserves are nearly 32.8 billion barrels, ranking 12th in the world. Regarding the country's natural gas reserves, also according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the current reserves are nearly 3.17 trillion, ranking 4th in the world, after Russia, Iran, and Qatar. According to OPEC, U.S. natural gas reserves are about 9 trillion cubic meters. Oil and gas in the United States are currently extracted in 32 out of the 50 states in the country's offshore areas. This is a map of oil production by state in 2021. You can see that about 71% of total U.S. crude oil production comes from 5 states, including Texas at 42.4%, New Mexico at 11.1%, North Dakota at 9.9%, Alaska at 3.9%, and Colorado at 3.7%. Additionally, about 15.2% of crude oil production is extracted from offshore fields in the Gulf of Mexico. Currently, the world's largest oil companies include U.S. companies such as ConocoPhillips, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Mary Petroleum, etc. These companies have provided millions of jobs and contributed significantly to the nation's GDP. As of 2021, the oil and natural gas industry created about 10.3 million jobs and accounted for 8% of U.S. GDP. However, the war between Russia and Ukraine seems to have turned everything upside down. So how has this war impacted the U.S. oil and gas industry? Let's explore together in Today. The U.S. oil and gas situation before. In 2021, the nation's natural gas and oil production reached near record highs compared to Among these, total U.S. crude oil production reached about 7.25 billion barrels, with a daily average production of 19. Shale oil production was 8.68 million barrels per day. This is a very large number, as the annual production is nearly double Vietnam's oil reserves and accounts for 20% of global total oil production. This is the ranking of top oil producers in 2021. We can see the United States is the top producer, followed by Saudi Arabia, Russia, Canada, China, Iraq, UAE, Brazil, Iran, and Kuwait. In 2021, U.S. petroleum consumption averaged about 19.8 million barrels per day, including about 1 million barrels for biofuels. This consumption level was assessed to be about 8% higher than in 2020. The reason given is the recovery of the U.S. economy from the impact of measures to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. For a massive economy like the United States, this consumption level is considered normal. But this, 67.2% is for transportation, 26.9% for industry, and the remainder for commercial and residential activities. This chart shows oil consumption by country in 2021. We can see the United States is the world's largest oil-consuming country, accounting for 20% of total global consumption. Next are China, India, Japan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Canada, South Korea, and Germany. Thus, comparing consumption with extraction, it is basically sufficient to meet domestic consumption demand. But this country still imports large quantities of oil from other countries. Additionally, in 2021 the U.S. imported about 8.6 million barrels of oil per day, making it the world's second largest crude oil importer. Imported oil mainly comes from Canada, the northern neighbor, with about 4.33 million barrels per day, accounting for about 50% of import demand. Next is Mexico, with about 710,000 barrels per day, accounting for over 8%. Followed by Russia, with 696,000 barrels per day. Additionally, the U.S. also buys oil from OPEC and OPEC Plus routes. OPEC's share accounts for only about 11% of imported crude oil, while the OPEC Plus route accounts for about 16.3%, excluding Russia. Extraction basically meets domestic demand, so why does the U.S. import so much additional oil? The answer is quite simple: to serve the domestic refining industry and export finished products to the global market. In 2021, the U.S. exported an average of about 8.54 million barrels of oil per day, meaning about 3.12 billion barrels. The main markets are India, followed by South Korea, Canada, the Netherlands, and China. According to EIA, the total export value of the U.S. in 2021 is estimated to be worth about $70 billion. Not only an oil power, the U.S. is also a natural gas power, as the total natural gas production in the U.S. in 2021 reached 934 billion cubic meters, or about 2.56 billion cubic meters per day. But consumption was only about 2.2. Calculating from 1998 to 2021, natural gas consumption in this country increased by nearly 548 million cubic meters and peaked in 2019 at about 2.33 billion cubic meters per day. Gas consumption mainly serves heating in winter and industrial activities related to the electricity and chemical sectors. Although domestic gas production is surplus, the country still imports an additional approximately 218 million in 2021, with about 99% coming from Canada. After removing impurities, about 56 million cubic meters of gas will be re-exported to Canada and about 132 million cubic meters will be exported to Mexico. For liquefied natural gas or LNG, which is natural gas liquefied by deep cooling to -106, after removing impurities, the country's exports reached a record high in 2021, averaging about 274.6 million cubic meters per day. The increase in U.S. LNG exports has been driven by rising demand in both Europe and Asia. South Korea, China, and Japan are the top 3 destinations, accounting for 35% of total U.S. LNG exports in 2021. Overall, in 2021, the United States also held a 23.1% share of global natural gas, surpassing Russia with 17.4%, and even the entire Middle East with 17.7%.
So what happened after the war broke out?
Although U.S. conventional oil production marked a significant recovery, overall, U.S. crude oil production in 2022 was not very optimistic. With total output reaching about 7.8 billion barrels and an average daily production of 19.68 million, a decrease of about 180,000 barrels per day. Specifically, shale oil production was 7.78 million barrels, while oil consumption in the United States increased to about 20.28 million barrels per day, resulting in a deficit of about 600. Oil imports also decreased by 27% compared to 2021, with the U.S. importing an average of about 6.28. In 2022, the main partner of the United States remained Canada, accounting for 51% of imports.
Second was Mexico, followed by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Colombia.
OPEC and OPEC Plus, excluding Russia, accounted for about 15% and 12% respectively.
And in 2022, there was no presence of Russian oil.
The reason is that on March 8, 2022, President Biden announced that the United States would ban imports of Russian oil, refined petroleum products, natural gas, and coal, while in 2021, the country accounted for 8% of U.S. oil imports. Along with a reduction in production and imports, there was also a decrease in exports. Specifically, the country reduced exports by up to 58% compared to 2021, exporting only about 3.6. In contrast to oil, U.S. gas production in 2022 increased by nearly 32% compared to 2020 and reached 1.23 trillion cubic meters, or about 3.37 billion cubic meters, but consumption increased by only about 10% to 2.51 billion cubic meters per day. This is considered the highest annual consumption level since records began in 1949. Overall, natural gas consumption increased across all sectors, but the energy sector consumed more than any other sector in the United States, accounting for 38% of the country's natural gas consumption. Therefore, production was still sufficient to meet domestic demand, even with a certain surplus. But the country still imported gas for refining and resale, with a slight increase compared to 2020. Specifically, in 2022, the United States imported about 234 million cubic meters of gas per day, an increase. However, on the export side, it was different, especially for in 2022, the United States became the world's second largest exporter of liquefied natural, with production reaching 300 million cubic meters per day, second only to Australia, and the main market for the United States was its European allies.
Why is that? The reason given is the Western sanctions targeting the Russian Federation,
along with the measures taken by the Moscow government in response, and the energy card is considered President Putin's trump card. Russia believes that after decades of relying on Russian gas at favorable prices, Europe cannot immediately switch to new gas sources overnight.
As oil and gas issues, in early 2022, Russia supplied 45% of the EU,
earning $900 million per day, and by October 2022, it had dropped to 7.5%. The state-owned oil and gas company Gazprom also gradually decreased from 38.5 billion cubic meters in Q1 2022 to 14 billion cubic.
Taking advantage of Europe's frantic efforts to stockpile gas during that winter, the United States stepped in and sold gas to Europe. In 2022, the increase in US LNG exports was driven by strong LNG demand in Europe.
International natural gas prices have since risen, and the United States liquefied natural gas US LNG exports to Europe in 2022 increased by 141%. Four countries, France, the United Kingdom, Spain, and the Netherlands, accounted for a total of 74% of US LNG exports to Europe. For the Asian market, US LNG exports decreased by 46%. Averaging 70.78 million cubic meters per day in 2020, accounting for about 23.6% of the country's export output. Most Asian countries reduced LNG imports from the US, especially China, which dropped only 28.3 million cubic, as the country has access to cheap natural gas from the Russian Federation,
as well as gas from Australia with lower transportation costs. Who really benefits?
When faced with EU price caps and sanctions, the Russian Federation shifted its focus to the Asian market, including two major markets, China and India. According to Chinese customs data, Russia exported about 1.72 million barrels of oil per day to China, an 8% increase compared to 2020. Also, according to data from China's General Administration of Customs, in the first 2 months of oil imports from Russia reached 1.77 million barrels per day, up from 1.57 million barrels in the same period. From this, Russia has become the largest crude oil supplier to China. From the above data, it can be seen that since the outbreak of the conflict, China has been Russia's main partner in oil and gas trade, helping Russia generate revenue to sustain. Meanwhile, China purchases crude oil at preferential prices from Russia, providing Beijing with raw materials for its economy and supplementing its reserves. In the event that China's economy gradually stabilizes and energy security is ensured, it is entirely feasible for them to sell some oil and gas and reserves for profit. If Russia fails to achieve its goals in the war with Ukraine, being sanctioned by the West and having to sell oil cheaply to China would be extremely disadvantageous. Additionally, Russia's oil and gas industry is overly dependent on a single consumer market.
In reality, Russia has bet everything on China.
Therefore, the issue of oil consumption in China poses a very high risk to the market due to its somewhat unstable economic and political foundation.
If you want to learn more about China's ambitions in the oil market,
you can search for and rewatch the video on the 5 More YouTube. The West imposed a series of economic sanctions on the Russian in protest of Moscow's military campaign in Ukraine, banning Moscow's energy products,
and launching a campaign to pressure Kremlin's oil revenue.
In this context, record crude oil imports from the United States
became a lifeline for Europe,
hoping to fill the gap in the necessary crude
for producing gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel.
2022 was considered a year when the energy map was redrawn
and triggered an energy crisis.
However, the U.S. oil and gas industry greatly benefited. Supply shortages coupled with market volatility drove gasoline prices high.
U.S. oil and gas companies expect to reap huge profits.
According to new research by Global Witness, Greenpeace USA, and Oil Change International, the U.S. oil and gas industry earned between $37 and $126 million.
However, that figure could be even higher.
Restrictions on energy imports from Russia contributed to rising gas prices and increased inflationary pressure across
the shipping activity
tracking company Kepler said. Since Russia launched its military campaign in Ukraine in late February 2020, the average monthly volume of goods shipped by sea to Europe has increased by 38% compared to the same period 12 months ago. According to the White House, U.S. natural gas shipments to Europe more than doubled in 2022, helping European households and producers cope with energy shortages after Russia turned out the taps.
Analysts say that high U.S. oil and gas output has helped soothe the market,
as the West restricted most Russian exports through sanctions
and price caps in recent months.
Before the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out, U.S. crude oil prices were typically about $3-4 per barrel,
oil traders determined.
This spread was sufficient to cover shipping costs from the U.S. to Europe and other expenses. But the price cap surged, at times reaching $10 per barrel when the conflict erupted. And economic clashes between Russia and the West disrupted shipping routes
and drove up demand for oil tankers.
Regarding natural gas, besides the U.S., Australia also has abundant gas. Distant water cannot quench a nearby. Shipping costs from that country to Europe are also extremely expensive, as the distance is 3 times longer than from. Thanks to this, the U.S. has become the most powerful position in the global energy industry since the 19th. With oil, the widening gap between European crude prices and U.S. crude has turned transatlantic shipments to the continent into a profit machine
for U.S. oil traders.
Major oil companies earned unprecedented profits in 20. For example, ExxonMobil made $5.5 billion after tax in the first quarter of. Chevron made $6.3 billion and ConocoPhillips made $5. Smaller energy producers like Occidental, Oxy, also reaped huge sums. Pioneer Natural Resources reported a $2 billion profit in the first, while Marathon Oil recorded $1.3 billion in. According to the latest report, in 2022, U.S. oil producers earned over $200 billion in profit. Based on these figures and analysis, in your opinion, who is benefiting, Russia, China, or the U.S.?
Please leave your comments below.
U.S. oil and gas outlook for 2023. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, while production activity in the North Sea oil fields between the UK, U.S. oil extraction companies are increasing output. The agency forecasts that U.S. oil production will reach a record in 2023. Also, according to the agency, the traditional crude oil production of the world's #1 superpower in 2023 will reach 12. That is, excluding shale oil, at a 5% increase from the 11.9 million barrels per day in 2022. If this level is maintained, this superpower's economy will achieve an annual extraction output of 4.58 billion barrels of oil. And of course, this figure does not include shale oil. Regarding natural gas, the agency also predicts that in the medium term, the U.S. will reach about 2.9 billion. If this level remains stable until year-end, the land of the stars and stripes will achieve 1,058 billion cubic meters of gas.
There are still no specific statistics on U.S. oil and gas import-export volumes. As statistics, large oil tanker fleets have increased crude oil shipments from the U.S. to the EU. Specifically, the capacity of oil shipments from the Gulf Coast to Europe reported by Caitlin was 1.53 million barrels per day in January 2023. But in recent months, Europe continues to receive more crude oil from the U.S. than Asia. Thus, 2023 is likely another bumper year for the U.S. oil and gas industry.
The above is the information that 5 minutes of research gathered about the U.S. oil and gas industry before and after the Russia. Thank you for watching the video until the end. See you in the next videos.
Please subscribe to the Gian Migo channel so you don't miss exciting videos.